The rain hammered down in thick sheets, turning the city into a chaotic maze of lights and reflections. Sophie Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart pounding in sync with the windshield wipers struggling against the flood. She was already an hour late, her mind spiraling with worst-case scenarios. Tonight was supposed to be her chance, the one evening where maybe, just maybe, her life would stop feeling like a constant series of almosts. Instead, she was about to crash, literally, taking a sharp turn into the valet entrance of the five-star Carlton Grand Hotel. Sophie barely noticed the figure crossing the driveway until it was too late. The brakes screeched, tires skidded, and a jolt sent her whole body forward. She gasped, slamming both feet on the brake, praying she hadn't just killed someone. When she jumped out of the car, her heart stopped altogether. Standing there, soaked but regal, was a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a high-end magazine. "I'm so sorry," Sophie cried, grabbing a handful of napkins from the car in panic. The man simply stared at her, those impossibly piercing, grey eyes unreadable. For a terrifying second, she thought he might call security or sue her into oblivion. Instead, he reached up, brushed the rain from his hair and said, "Well, that's one way to introduce yourself." Sophie flushed, torn between mortification and disbelief. "I didn't see you. I was late. And the rain. And the valet," she stammered, words tumbling out in chaotic waves. He raised a single brow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Relax. I'm not dead." Then he extended his hand, as if she hadn't nearly committed vehicular manslaughter. "Ethan Wright." Still trembling, Sophie shook his hand, feeling an electric jolt that had nothing to do with the storm. "Sophie Carter," she murmured, cheeks burning. He nodded, slipping his hands casually into the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit. Rain dripping off the ends of his hair, but making him look maddeningly unbothered. "You're late," he said, glancing at the grand clock towering above the hotel entrance. She gave a helpless laugh, too tired to pretend otherwise. "Story of my life." He stared at her a moment longer, something unreadable flashing across his face, then turned and strode inside without another word, leaving Sophie drenched and rattled. Shaking off the shock, Sophie grabbed her clutch and hurried after him, muttering to herself, "Just my luck. Hit a model on the way to the biggest night of my life." She barreled into the lobby, where chandeliers glistened and laughter echoed off marble walls. The gala was in full swing, and she looked like a drowned rat. Perfect. Sophie tried to sneak through the grand ballroom's side entrance, her heels clicking traitorously on the polished floors. A server offered her a towel with a pitying smile, which she gratefully accepted. As she dabbed at her ruined hair, she caught sight of him again, Ethan, standing by the stage, dry now and commanding the room with effortless ease. Of course, because she couldn't just hit a regular person. No, she had to almost run over the guy who clearly owned the place. As if sensing her gaze, Ethan turned his head, locking eyes with her from across the room. Sophie froze, towel mid-air, her pulse stuttering. To her horror, he began walking toward her. Each step was deliberate, confident, and she couldn't help but notice the way conversations around him hushed. Whoever Ethan Wright was, he was used to being the center of gravity, and now he was headed straight for her, the woman who had greeted him with a fender-bender. "Enjoying the party?" he asked smoothly, voice low enough that only she could hear. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to channel even a shred of dignity. "I'm not exactly dressed for it," she admitted. His gaze flicked over her, lingering just a fraction too long. "I think you fit right in. Everyone here is pretending to be something they're not." Something about the way he said it made her insides twist. She opened her mouth to respond, but he was already gone, moving through the crowd with a grace that belied his size. Sophie blinked, feeling as if she had imagined the whole encounter. But no, the faint scent of his cologne still clung to her senses, infuriatingly real. A soft tap on her shoulder snapped her back to reality. It was her friend Mia, eyes wide. "Do you have any idea who you just crashed into?" Sophie groaned, already dreading the answer. "Please tell me he's just a guest." Mia shook her head vigorously. "That's Ethan Wright, CEO of Wright Global, billionaire. Rumor has it he crushes companies for sport." Sophie wanted to melt into the floor. She wrapped the towel tighter around her, as if it could shield her from her own disaster. "Great! I'll be lucky if I don't get a cease and desist letter by morning." Mia laughed, linking arms with her. "Or a marriage proposal. You never know with these types." Sophie shook her head, smiling despite herself, but as she glanced across the room and found Ethan watching her again, this time with an expression she couldn't quite decode, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disdain. It was curiosity, dangerous, impossible curiosity, and somehow she knew this night was only the beginning. The gala roared on with the kind of superficial glamour Sophie had always loathed. Laughter echoed from corners where deals disguised as jokes were made, and every clink of champagne glasses sounded rehearsed. Sophie pulled her damp shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling utterly out of place. Somewhere between the glint of diamonds and the roar of ambition, she lost sight of why she even agreed to attend in the first place. She wandered toward the edge of the ballroom, looking for a place to breathe. From the corner of her eye, she caught Ethan again. This time, he was locked in conversation with a group of stern-faced men in expensive suits, exuding power so naturally it seemed woven into the air around him. Yet even as he spoke, his gaze flicked toward her, a flash so quick that she wondered if she'd imagined it. Sophie turned away sharply, embarrassed by how her heart responded every time their eyes met. This was ridiculous. She was here to network, to maybe find a job lead, anything to keep her crumbling architecture career afloat, not to moon over a man she had almost flattened. "Pull it together," she muttered to herself, slipping through a side corridor where the noise faded. In the quieter hallway, Sophie finally allowed herself to breathe. The opulence here was even more pronounced. Velvet drapes, gold-framed paintings, marble floors that gleamed under soft lighting. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, trying to steady herself. "Rough night?" a voice drawled, startling her out of her reverie. She opened her eyes to find Ethan once again in front of her, his hands casually tucked into his trouser pockets, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You have a talent," he added, "for disappearing in a room full of people." Sophie bristled, annoyed at herself for not hearing him approach, and annoyed at him for noticing. "Maybe I just don't belong here," she said lightly, trying to sidestep him. But Ethan moved too, blocking her path with effortless precision. "Maybe," he said, voice dropping to something quieter, something dangerous, "you belong somewhere better." His words sent a shiver down her spine, but Sophie masked it with a scoff. "Do you always flirt with people who almost kill you?" Ethan chuckled, and the sound was so rich, so genuine, that it chipped away at her defenses. "Only when it's memorable," he said. Sophie shook her head, trying not to smile. This wasn't a game she wanted to play. Not here, not with him. "Look," she said, gathering her courage, "I'm sorry for earlier, really. If you want me to pay for any dry cleaning, just send the bill." He tilted his head, studying her like she was some complicated blueprint. "I think you've paid enough," he said. "You look like you fought a hurricane and lost." Sophie laughed despite herself, the sound awkward but real. For a moment, something unspoken flickered between them, something raw and human that didn't belong. In a ballroom filled with polished lies, a heavy silence fell, thick with words neither of them knew how to say. Sophie shifted her weight, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he stood. Close enough to see the faint stubble along his jaw, the rain-soaked edges of his collar, the glint of something wounded behind his steady eyes. "I should get back," she mumbled, breaking eye contact. "To what?" Ethan asked, voice almost too soft to hear. Sophie glanced back at the ballroom, where people moved like marionettes under invisible strings. "To pretending I fit in," she said, her voice heavier than she intended. Ethan's jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his features. "You don't have to," he said. "Not with me." The vulnerability in his tone was so startling, so out of place, that Sophie stumbled over her words. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Ethan smiled then, not the charming public one she'd seen before, but something real. "Maybe I want to," he said simply. Sophie felt the floor tilt beneath her, her instincts screaming for her to run before she drowned in something she couldn't control. But she didn't move. Neither did he. A voice crackled through the hotel speakers, announcing the start of the charity auction. The spell between them broke. Ethan straightened, smoothing his jacket like slipping on armor. "Duty calls," he said with a wink. Sophie nodded, still rooted to the spot as he walked away. She watched him merge back into the crowd, swallowed whole by the world he ruled. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the wild drum of her heart. What was happening to her? She wasn't the type to get swept away by men, let alone billionaires who carried danger like a second skin. Yet somehow, in the span of one chaotic, rain-soaked night, Ethan Wright had unsettled everything she thought she knew about herself. And somewhere deep inside, a small, reckless voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Sophie woke with a start, her heart pounding, like she had overslept for something important. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, painting long slashes across her cluttered apartment. She sat up slowly, blinking the previous night's memories into focus. Rain, the screech of brakes, Ethan Wright's eyes pinning her to the spot. It was absurd how vividly she could recall every detail, like her brain had decided to file that particular humiliation under Do Not Forget. She swung her legs out of bed, groaning at the stiffness in her shoulders. Her phone buzzed angrily on the nightstand. 6 missed calls from her temp agency, a few emails about overdue rent, and one strange number she didn't recognize. She frowned but shoved the phone into her bag without checking. She had real problems to deal with, starting with the final interview she had scheduled for a junior architect position at Ravenwood Designs. After a lukewarm shower and a battle with a stubborn curling iron, Sophie finally looked halfway presentable. She grabbed her battered portfolio, slipped on her only decent pair of heels, and headed into the city. Every step toward Ravenwood felt heavier, weighted with desperation she refused to acknowledge. This job was supposed to be her new start. Clean slate, no billionaires, no accidental vehicular assaults. When she arrived, the lobby was buzzing with applicants, all dressed sharper and smiling wider than she could manage. Sophie clutched her portfolio tighter, feeling the old doubt creep in. "You don't belong here." Before she could talk herself into leaving, her name was called. She plastered on her best professional smile and followed the receptionist down a polished corridor. The interview panel was exactly what she'd expected. 2 senior architects, a bored-looking HR rep, and a hiring manager who wore a perpetual sneer. They grilled her about project management, technical drawings, client relations, topics she could handle in her sleep. Yet, as she answered, Sophie felt a strange undercurrent in the room, an energy she couldn't place. It wasn't until the hiring manager, Mr. Levin, leaned back in his chair and asked, "How do you feel about working with powerful, difficult clients?" that her stomach dropped. Something about the way he said it, the slight smirk, made her blood run cold. "I'm adaptable," Sophie answered carefully. Mr. Levin exchanged a look with one of the senior architects. "Good," he said, "because our latest investor is very particular." Sophie's mind raced. Investor. She hadn't seen anything about external investors in the job description. Before she could ask, the HR rep cheerfully added, "Actually, he requested to personally approve the final candidate. It's a bit unusual, but Well, he's the reason we can fund the Ravenwood expansion project. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. "And who is this investor?" she asked, voice steady. Mr. Levin's smirk widened. "I'm sure you'll meet him soon enough." Something inside her twisted into a knot. This wasn't right. But she nodded, finished the interview, and left the building with a fake smile glued to her face. Outside, the city roared around her, but Sophie barely noticed. She wandered toward a small cafe tucked between two skyscrapers and collapsed into a chair, her mind spinning. Her instincts screamed at her, "Walk away!" But then her phone buzzed again, the same unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Sophie Carter," a familiar, infuriatingly calm voice said. Her stomach dropped. "Ethan Wright," she whispered. "We meet again," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "How was the interview?" Sophie gritted her teeth. "That was you? You set that up?" "Technically," Ethan said smoothly. "I invested in the firm. They needed capital. I needed talent. It seemed mutually beneficial." Sophie wanted to scream. "You can't just buy my career path," she snapped. Ethan's voice softened. "I'm not buying anything, Sophie. I'm offering you a chance." "A chance to what? Owe you forever?" she said bitterly. There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "A chance to choose something better. For yourself." Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, anger and confusion warring inside her. "I don't want your charity," she said, barely above a whisper. "It's not charity," Ethan said. "It's recognition." Another pause, heavier this time. "You're extraordinary, Sophie. I saw it the moment you almost ran me over." Against her will, a tiny laugh escaped her. "That's a weird compliment, right?" he chuckled. "I specialize in weird." Silence stretched between them, thick and complicated. Finally, Ethan said, "The offer stands. Take the job. On your terms. No strings." Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't, because somewhere deep inside, a small, dangerous hope was beginning to bloom, and she didn't know yet if it would save her or destroy her. Sophie didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the cracks in her ceiling, Ethan's words ricocheting through her skull. "Take the job, on your terms, no strings." It sounded simple, almost too simple, but nothing about Ethan Wright was ever simple. He was a man who moved through the world pulling invisible strings, and she had no doubt that once she stepped into his orbit, she'd never get free. The next morning dawned grey and heavy. Sophie pulled on her favorite worn jeans and a sweater too large for her frame, needing something comfortable to armor herself with. She made coffee she barely drank and stared at her phone for an hour, debating. At exactly 9 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A simple message, "Your call. Either way, I'll respect it. E." Something inside her twisted painfully. Was it arrogance that he assumed she would accept? Or was it faith? Against her better judgment, Sophie typed a single word. "Okay." The reply came almost instantly, like he'd been waiting. "Welcome to Ravenwood. You start Monday." Monday came faster than she was ready for. Sophie entered Ravenwood Designs with a heart that thundered louder than her boots on the polished floors. She was led to her new office, a modest glass cubicle with a breathtaking view of the city skyline. It was more than she'd dared to hope for. It was terrifying. Her days fell into a strange rhythm. Meetings, site visits, endless blueprints sprawled across her desk. She barely saw Ethan, and when she did, it was always from a distance, him striding through the hallways like a storm contained in a suit, leaving murmurs and tension in his wake. Sometimes she caught him watching her, a flicker of something raw crossing his face before it smoothed into cool detachment. One afternoon, Sophie was knee-deep in redesigns when her supervisor, Diana Grant, a woman who looked carved from marble, stopped by her cubicle. "You're wanted upstairs," Diana said, voice clipped. Sophie frowned. "Upstairs?" Diana nodded once. "Mr. Wright's private floor." Sophie's stomach twisted. "Now?" "Unless you'd prefer to keep him waiting," Diana said. Dryly, Sophie swallowed her nerves and gathered her sketches. She took the private elevator up, the ride too fast and too slow all at once. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world unlike anything downstairs. Minimalist, expensive, eerily silent. Ethan's office door was ajar. She knocked once. Before stepping in, he was behind his desk, typing something on a laptop. When he looked up, Sophie was struck again by how dangerous he looked when he wasn't smiling. "Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, standing up. "Thanks for coming." "I didn't realize it was optional," she quipped before she could stop herself. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Technically, it's not." He gestured to the seat opposite him. "Sit!" Sophie sat, back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. She hated how he could make her feel 17 years old and reckless just by breathing the same air. "I reviewed your redesigns for the Martinson project," Ethan said, sliding a folder across the desk. "They're impressive." Sophie blinked, thrown off balance. "Thank you." "But," he added, and there it was, the other shoe, "you're playing it safe, too safe." Sophie bristled. "Maybe because I don't want to risk a multi-million-dollar mistake." Ethan leaned forward, grey eyes sharp. "Or maybe because you're afraid." Sophie flushed. "Afraid of what?" "Of what happens when you stop following everyone else's rules," he said quietly. The words hit harder than she expected. She looked away, pretending to study the blueprints. Ethan didn't press. Instead, he sat back, watching her with that maddening patience. "I didn't bring you here to be another cog in the machine, Sophie. I brought you here because you see things differently." She met his gaze then, something fragile and dangerous blooming between them. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice almost breaking. Ethan was silent for a long beat before he said, "I want you to be the person you were always meant to be, unapologetically." The air between them crackled with something unspoken. Sophie rose slowly, her hands trembling. "That's a nice sentiment," she said, her voice thick. "But words are cheap, Mr. Wright." Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then prove me wrong." She turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. In the empty hallway, Sophie leaned against the cold glass, her breath coming fast and shallow. She didn't know what terrified her more, that Ethan believed in her, or that for the first time in a very long time, she was starting to believe in herself too. By Friday, Sophie felt like she had lived a month inside Ravenwood's polished walls. Every day was a tightrope walk, balancing her ambition against the pull she felt every time Ethan entered the room. She worked late, stayed invisible, convinced herself that success meant staying out of his orbit. It almost worked. Almost. Late. That night, the office was nearly deserted, the city's neon veins pulsing outside the windows. Sophie was bent over blueprints, headphones on, when she felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. She looked up sharply, but it wasn't Ethan standing there. It was someone else, a woman, tall, immaculate, predatory in the way only old money could perfect. "You must be Sophie Carter," the woman said, voice low and syrupy. Sophie pulled off her headphones slowly. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, but it was a smile without kindness. "I'm Vanessa Langford, a close associate of Mr. Wright." The emphasis was deliberate, the implication crystal clear. Sophie rose to her feet, instinctively bracing herself. "Nice to meet you." Vanessa let her gaze travel over Sophie's worn jeans and coffee-stained sketches with a condescension so sharp it could draw blood. "I like to stay informed about who enters his world," she said casually, gliding a fingertip along Sophie's desk. Sophie stiffened. I'm just here for work. Vanessa's smile widened, all teeth now. Oh, darling, work is never just work when it comes to Ethan. She leaned in, dropping her voice. You should be careful. Men like Ethan, they collect pretty things, and when they're done playing, she shrugged elegantly, they discard them. The words hit harder than Sophie wanted to admit. She forced a polite smile. Thanks for the unsolicited advice. Vanessa tilted her head, mock sympathy radiating from every pore. Just don't mistake his attention for permanence. It never is. With that, Vanessa pivoted gracefully on her heels and disappeared down the hallway, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume and a seed of doubt behind her. Sophie sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She told herself Vanessa was lying, manipulating, but a small, treacherous voice whispered, what if she wasn't? That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, replaying Vanessa's words, picking them apart, trying to strip them of power, but the damage was done. In the harsh light of her insecurities, everything about Ethan, the way he looked at her, the way he challenged her, started to feel like a carefully orchestrated game. The next morning, she found an envelope tucked under her apartment door. No return address, no markings, just her name scrawled in sharp, aggressive strokes. Heart hammering, she tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white. Ethan and Vanessa, together at some kind of gala, laughing, heads bent close. There was no note. None was needed. Sophie sat on the floor, the photo trembling in her hands. Logic warred with emotion. It was an old photo. Ethan's hair was longer, his jawline less sharp. It didn't prove anything, and yet the timing, the precision. Someone wanted her to see this. Someone wanted to plant a doubt that would be impossible to unroot. By the time Monday arrived, Sophie had built walls around her heart so high even she struggled to see over them. She showed up at Ravenwood, chin high, emotions locked down tight. When Ethan passed her in the hall, she nodded coolly, ignoring the flicker of confusion and something that looked almost like hurt on his face. She told herself it was better this way, safer, cleaner, detached. Yet, as she sat in her cubicle pretending to focus, a hollow ache gnawed at her ribs. She hated that a stranger's warning and a single grainy photo had the power to rattle her so completely. But trust, for Sophie Carter, was not a currency she handed out easily. And Ethan Wright, for all his charisma and promises, was still a stranger who could unravel her with one glance if she let him. By midweek, the distance between Sophie and Ethan had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the polite nods or the clipped greetings. It was something heavier, woven into every glance they didn't share, every word left unsaid. Sophie buried herself in work, piling blueprints around her like shields, but avoidance wasn't armor. It was a slow, suffocating surrender. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. He wasn't a man who missed details. On Thursday afternoon, as Sophie left the conference room after presenting a redesigned proposal, she felt him watching her. His gaze burned between her shoulder blades, but she kept walking, kept pretending she hadn't spent nights dissecting every moment they'd shared, every word Vanessa had poisoned. That night, after everyone else had gone home, Sophie was still in the office, reviewing contracts by the dim light of her desk lamp. She didn't hear him approach. She just looked up, and there he was. Ethan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The silence was so heavy, it threatened to crack the walls around her. "You're avoiding me," he said finally, voice low. Sophie clicked her pen closed, refusing to meet his eyes. "I'm busy." Ethan pushed off the doorframe, closing the distance between them. "You were never just busy before." Sophie forced a laugh, brittle and sharp. Maybe I finally figured out how to focus." Ethan watched her for a long moment, then said quietly, "What did she tell you?" Sophie stiffened. "Who?" "Vanessa," he said, and there was steel beneath the softness now. "She visited you, didn't she?" Sophie pressed her lips together, debating. Lying to him would be easy, but looking into those eyes that always seemed to see too much, made it impossible. "She warned me," Sophie said finally, voice low. "Warned me that you collect people, that you discard them when you're bored." Ethan's face didn't change, but the air around him seemed to tighten. "And you believed her," he said softly. Sophie looked away, shame and anger twisting together inside her. "I don't know what to believe." He stepped closer. Too close. "Believe what you know about me, not what others say." Sophie's throat burned. "I don't know you," she whispered. "Not really." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then let me change that." His hand brushed hers, just a whisper of contact, and the electricity was immediate, violent. Sophie snatched her hand back like she'd been burned. "I can't," she said. "I won't. Be another mistake you make, Ethan." His eyes darkened, and for the first time she saw something raw and wounded flicker across his face. "You're not a mistake," he said hoarsely. "You never were." The confession cracked something inside her. Sophie stood there, breathing hard, caught between the instinct to run and the desperate, dangerous desire to stay. Ethan didn't move. He just looked at her, a man stripped of all his shields, waiting, offering nothing but the brutal truth. Of himself. It would be so easy to step into him, to let the past fall away. But the fear was louder, fear of falling, fear of breaking, fear of discovering that Vanessa had been right all along. Sophie shook her head slowly, tears stinging her eyes. "I need space," she said, voice breaking. Ethan nodded once. A movement. So small it might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't been watching him so closely. "I'll wait," he said simply. Then he turned and left, the echo of his footsteps trailing behind him like a ghost. Sophie sank back into her chair, trembling. She knew she had hurt him. She knew she had hurt herself too. But sometimes walls were easier than wounds, safer, cleaner. Yet as she stared at the empty doorway where Ethan had stood, a terrible, aching certainty bloomed in her chest. Walls, no matter how strong, were never meant to last forever. They were meant to crumble. The days that followed blurred into a heavy fog of silence. Sophie buried herself even deeper into work, arriving early and leaving late, determined to leave no cracks for Ethan to slip through. But no matter how much she tried to suffocate her feelings, she couldn't ignore the hollow ache that expanded inside her chest with every passing hour. Friday evening found her alone again, the office lights dimmed and the city twinkling beyond, the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat back in her chair, exhausted, staring at the blueprint spread before her without seeing a single line. Her mind was a battlefield, Ethan's face haunting the edges of every thought. Why was it so hard to let him go? Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of the spiral. A new email. Anonymous sender. Subject, "Know who you're trusting." Heart thundering, Sophie opened it. Attached was a document, a police report. She clicked it open with trembling fingers. Ethan Wright, involved in a corporate lawsuit 5 years ago. Accusations of insider trading, settled quietly. No criminal charges, but the words ethical misconduct screamed from the page. Sophie sat frozen, ice threading through her veins. Vanessa's warnings. The photo, now this. Every instinct screamed, run. Yet some stubborn part of her clung to reason. People could be framed, stories could be twisted. She needed more, needed the truth from the source, not filtered through whispers and half-truths. On impulse, Sophie grabbed her coat and stormed out of the building. She didn't know where Ethan lived, at least not officially, but she knew his favorite haunt. A private rooftop lounge atop the Stanton Hotel. If he wasn't there, she would find him another way. Tonight she needed answers, no more hiding. The elevator doors opened into a soft pulse of jazz music and dim lighting. Sophie scanned the room and found him immediately. Ethan sat at a corner table, alone, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring out over the glittering skyline as if it held all the answers he could never reach. Gathering every ounce of courage she had left, Sophie crossed the floor toward him. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. "Sophie," he said, standing instinctively. His voice was rough, almost hesitant, and that hesitation nearly broke her. "We need to talk," she said, cutting to the chase. Ethan gestured for her to sit, but Sophie shook her head. "No games, Ethan, no charm, just the truth." His jaw tightened. "About what?" She tossed her phone onto the table, the police report glaring from the screen. "About this." For a heartbeat, Ethan said nothing. His eyes darkened, his hand curling into a fist against the table. Then he spoke, voice low. "It's true." Sophie's heart sank. She hadn't realized until that moment how desperately she had hoped he would deny it, laugh it off. "I made mistakes," Ethan continued, "when I was younger, arrogant, thought I was invincible." Sophie crossed her arms, forcing herself to remain standing. "You manipulated a company from the inside." Ethan flinched, and the rawness of that tiny reaction made her waver. "I didn't steal," he said. "I didn't hurt anyone. But I crossed lines, blurred them until I couldn't see where right ended and wrong began." His voice cracked slightly, and Sophie hated how her heart responded. "They wanted to crucify me," he said. "And they could have, but they settled. I paid my price. I rebuilt everything from scratch." He looked up at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes shattered her defenses. "I'm not that man anymore." Sophie stood frozen, warring with herself. She had come here demanding the truth. She had gotten it. But truth, she realized, wasn't always clean. It wasn't always black and white. Sometimes it was a scar, ugly, painful, but proof of survival, proof of change. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Ethan let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for years. "Because you already looked at me like I was someone worth believing in. I didn't want to see that change." His voice broke. "Not like this." Tears blurred Sophie's vision, but she blinked them away fiercely. She needed to be strong, for both of them. "You should have trusted me," she said. "If there's any chance at all, any chance for this, you have to let me see the worst parts of you, not just the parts you want me to love." Ethan stood slowly, his hands trembling. "I'm trying," he said hoarsely. "I just don't know if I'm enough." Sophie took a shaky step closer, until only inches separated them. "Let me decide that," she whispered. For a long, aching moment, they just stood there, breathing the same charged air. Then, slowly, carefully, Ethan reached out, and Sophie didn't pull away. The night air wrapped around them like a heavy curtain as Ethan and Sophie stood frozen, caught between the ghosts of who they had been and the fragile hope of who they might become. Neither dared to speak. Words had caused so much damage already. It was in the silence, the tentative way Ethan's fingers brushed hers, that the truth lived. Sophie inhaled shakily, her mind a tangle of instincts. Every fiber of her said, "Run, this was dangerous, reckless." But something deeper, something far older inside her, whispered, "Stay." So she did. She let his hand close gently around hers, let herself feel the rawness of his touch, the unspoken apology trembling in his fingertips. Ethan pulled out a chair, a silent invitation. Sophie sat down slowly, her body tense, unsure. He sank into the chair across from her, resting his arms on the table, palms open, a gesture of surrender. It was such a small thing, but it knocked the air from her lungs, Men like Ethan didn't surrender, not unless it mattered. "I don't expect forgiveness," Ethan said finally, his voice low and rough. "Hell, I don't even deserve it. But I need you to know. I'm not proud of the man. I used to be." Sophie studied him, the way his eyes darkened with shame, the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than any empire could justify. "Who are you now?" she asked, voice softer than she intended. Ethan's lips quirked into a sad half-smile. "Someone who's trying," he said. "Someone who's tired of running from the pieces he broke." He shook his head, looking almost bewildered. "And then you come crashing into my life, literally, and suddenly nothing makes sense anymore." Sophie looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. She understood more than she wanted to admit. She had spent so long building walls around herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to hope, to believe that broken things could be repaired, that people could be more than the worst parts of their past. "I'm scared," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had said in months. Ethan leaned closer, his gaze steady. "So am I." 3 words. Small, heavy, shattering. Sophie's breath hitched. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and terrifying and real. They sat there until the rooftop cleared out, until only the hum of the city remained. No declarations, no promises, just 2 people clinging to the fragile threads of possibility. When Ethan finally stood, he didn't offer her a hand. He just stood there, waiting, as if letting her choose. Sophie rose slowly, her body aching, from the tension of holding herself together. Ethan walked beside her toward the elevator, not touching, not pressing, just existing in parallel. And somehow, it felt more intimate than any kiss they had shared. Inside the elevator, the silence thickened again. Sophie stared at the numbers descending, heart pounding. At the lobby, the doors slid open, but neither of them moved. Ethan turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie, if you walk away now, I'll let you." She looked up at him, at the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, and she realized trust wasn't about guarantees. It was about choosing to believe when every instinct screamed not to, about choosing to risk heartbreak because maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. Sophie stepped out of the elevator first. She walked 10 paces toward the doors, heart breaking with every step, and then, slowly, achingly, she turned around. Ethan stood frozen in the elevator, watching her, devastation carved into every line of his body. Without a word, Sophie held out her hand. Ethan didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her hand like a man drowning, pulling her close, resting his forehead against hers. They stood there in the middle of a hotel lobby where strangers bustled past, clinging to each other like a lifeline. Neither of them said, "I'm sorry." Neither of them said, "I love you." It was too soon for that, too raw. But in that moment, they both understood something far more important. This wasn't about perfection. It was about fighting for each other, even when it was easier to let go. Especially then. Saturday morning found Sophie curled up on the worn couch of her tiny apartment, a coffee cup balanced on her knees, staring at the sunlight slanting through the window. She hadn't slept much. Her mind spun, looping through everything Ethan had confessed, everything she had felt last night. No neat conclusions, no fairy tale ending, just uncertainty and a cautious, stubborn hope. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Lunch, no suits, no pressure, just us." Sophie smiled despite herself. She typed back, "Sounds dangerous." A minute later, his reply, "Only if you like bad diners and worse coffee." She laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar in her own apartment. Maybe danger wasn't always a bad thing. They met at a tiny, run-down diner on the east side, a place with cracked leather booths and waitresses who called you honey without asking your name. Ethan was already there when she arrived, dressed in jeans and a plain black t-shirt that made him look impossibly normal and impossibly devastating. He stood when he saw her, an old-fashioned habit she hadn't realized she missed until now. "You came," he said, voice soft. Sophie slid into the booth across from him, her nerves a tangle of barbed wire. "I said I would." Ethan smiled, small and genuine, and for a second the weight in her chest lifted. They ordered greasy pancakes and burnt coffee, and for a while they talked about nothing. Favorite movies, worst vacations, the worst pizza they ever had. It was easy, natural. The kind of conversation Sophie had almost forgotten existed. No hidden motives, no walls, just the simple, terrifying act of being known. But underneath the laughter, Sophie felt the pressure building, the unspoken when not if of the next hard conversation. She could sense it in Ethan, too, the way he fidgeted with his coffee cup, the way his smile sometimes slipped when he thought. She wasn't looking. Finally, after the check was paid and the diner began to empty around them, Ethan spoke. "I told you about my mistakes," he said, his voice cautious. "But I don't know anything about yours." Sophie stiffened. She hadn't expected him to ask. She had built her life on avoiding those stories, hiding the cracks deep enough no one could find them. "You don't have to," Ethan said quickly, sensing her withdrawal. "Not if you're not ready." Sophie stared down at the chipped table. She could lie. She could deflect. But something about the way Ethan waited, patient, steady, made her want to be brave, made her want to be real. "My father," she said quietly, "he wasn't a good man." She kept her eyes on the table, afraid to see pity in Ethan's gaze. He was charming, brilliant, everyone loved him, but at home it was different. He drank, he lied, he made promises he never intended to keep. The words burned coming out, like reopening an old wound that had never properly healed. "When I was 17, he vanished," Sophie continued, "left behind debts, lawsuits, a wrecked reputation, and me, alone, trying to clean up the mess he made." Her hands shook slightly. She clenched them into fists. "I swore I'd never trust charm again. Never trust promises. Never believe in anything that could be taken away." Sophie let out a shaky breath, finally lifting her eyes to Ethan's. To her shock, she didn't see pity there. She saw something infinitely more dangerous. Understanding. Ethan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. His touch was warm, solid. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. Sophie blinked back tears she hadn't realized were forming. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him more than anything, but the fear was still there, coiled tight inside her chest. Trust wasn't built in a day. It wasn't a switch you flipped because someone said the right words. It was a choice, a risk, and Sophie had spent her whole life being too scared to take it. Maybe it was time to be scared and still leap anyway. Maybe that was what real courage looked like. The diner faded into memory, but the vulnerability they had shared there clung to Sophie like a second skin. She felt it in every breath she took, every glance she exchanged with Ethan. It was fragile, this tentative bond, something new and trembling, like a thread stretched across a canyon. One wrong move, and it would snap. Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that mirrored the tension prickling under Sophie's skin. She walked into Ravenwood feeling lighter somehow and terrified of it. She wasn't used to hope. It unsettled her more than any disappointment ever had. Hope meant you had something to lose. By mid-morning, Ethan appeared at her office door. He didn't step inside, just leaned against the frame with a small, secret smile that made Sophie's pulse race. "Lunch later?" he asked. Sophie nodded, biting. Becca grinned, just a small lunch, no pressure, no declarations. It felt like progress, but progress was never easy. Just before noon, Diana Grant, the firm's stone-cold director, called Sophie into the conference room. Sophie entered warily, sensing the unusual tension in the air. Diana stood by the window, stiff as iron, her back to the room. On the table lay a thick envelope stamped confidential. Sophie's stomach dropped. "You've been doing excellent work," Diana said without turning. "Impressive, really." Sophie's pulse quickened. Compliments from Diana were rarer than solar eclipses. "Thank you," she said cautiously. Diana finally turned, her expression unreadable. "Which is why this complicates things?" She slid the envelope towards Sophie. "Anonymous tip. About you. About Mr. Wright." Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. Hands trembling slightly, she opened the envelope and the world tilted sideways. Inside were photos. Grainy, like the first one, only this time it was her. Sophie, leaving Ethan's apartment, smiling up at him in the lobby, getting into his car. Proof that something existed between them. Sophie's vision blurred. "Who sent this?" she managed to ask. "Diana's." Mouth was a thin, grim line. "Does it matter?" She paused. "You're not being fired yet, but you need to understand. This project, this company, they can't afford scandal." Sophie gripped the edge of the table, trying to ground herself. "There's no scandal," she said. "Not yet," Diana replied, "but perceptions matter." Her gaze softened, just a fraction. "You're talented, Sophie. Don't throw it away because of a man who already has more power than he knows what to do with." The words stung, because part of Sophie agreed. She had fought so hard to climb out of the shadows her father left behind. She couldn't lose everything she had built. Not for anyone. Not even for Ethan. But as she stood in that sterile room, holding the evidence of her own betrayal in her hands, she realized something even more terrifying. She didn't want to lose Ethan either. She left the conference room in a daze. Her legs carried her down the hallway on autopilot. She barely noticed the stairs, the whispers curling in her wake. Gossip was already blooming, and Sophie knew how fast it could rot everything it touched. Ethan was waiting for her by the elevators, oblivious to the wildfire spreading through the office. His face lit up when he saw her, and the sight nearly broke her. "You ready for lunch?" he asked, voice warm. Sophie hesitated. For a heartbeat, she almost said no, almost walked away. It would be easier, cleaner, safer, but she thought of the diner, of Ethan's hand covering hers, of the way he had looked at her, not like she was broken, but like she was worth the fight. So she forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, let's go." They rode the elevator in silence, the air between them humming with things left unsaid. Sophie caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, pale, shaken, afraid. She wasn't sure if Ethan noticed. If he did, he said nothing. Maybe he was afraid too. Outside, the city roared around them. Sophie walked beside Ethan, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, but not close enough to touch. She wanted to reach out, wanted to lean on him, but she didn't. Because she knew deep down that the next few days would decide everything, not just about her career, but about whether she and Ethan could survive the storm that was coming for them. Lunch was a hollow ritual. Sophie pushed food around her plate while Ethan talked about an upcoming investment pitch, oblivious to the bomb ticking between them. She nodded at the right moments, smiled when she should, all the while feeling like her world was slipping further out of reach with every heartbeat. Afterward, Ethan suggested a walk through the small park behind the building. Sophie agreed, needing the air, needing the space to think. The crisp autumn breeze tugged at her hair as they strolled beneath fiery red and gold trees. It was beautiful, the kind of afternoon that should have felt like peace. Instead, Sophie's chest was a cage of knives. "You're quiet," Ethan said, glancing down at her. His voice was casual, but she caught the tension hidden beneath it. He felt it too. The shift, the storm brewing. Sophie stuffed her hands into her coat pockets, eyes on the ground. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" Ethan pressed gently. Sophie hesitated, heart pounding. She could lie. She could protect them both a little longer. But something inside her rebelled. She was tired of half-truths, tired of being afraid. She stopped walking. Ethan stopped too, turning to face her fully. "There's talk," she said carefully. "At Ravenwood, about us." His expression didn't change, but Sophie saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. "Who?" he asked. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is... It's not just gossip. Someone sent photos, documents. They're using us to create a scandal." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Whoever it is, I'll shut it down." His voice was sharp, cold, the CEO emerging. Sophie flinched. "That's not the point," she said, struggling to keep her voice even. "The point is, people think I got here because of you, that I didn't earn it, that everything I've worked for is a joke." Ethan stepped closer, his anger shifting into something desperate. "I never wanted that for you, Sophie, I swear." She looked up at him, aching. "I know, but it doesn't change how it looks." She swallowed hard. "And I can't lose myself in this." Silence fell between them, heavy and cruel. Sophie saw the battle raging behind Ethan's eyes, the need to protect her, the fear of losing her, the impossible truth that maybe love alone wasn't enough to fix this, not if the cost was too high. "I'll pull out," Ethan said suddenly, "from Ravenwood, from the project. I'll make it clean." Sophie's breath caught. "You can't," she whispered. "You've invested too much." He smiled, but it was broken. "I'd rather lose a deal than lose you." The words shattered something inside her. Sophie reached out, touching his face gently. "Don't make promises you'll regret." Ethan caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I won't," he said fiercely. "I swear." But promises, Sophie knew, were fragile things, and life had a brutal way of tearing them apart. That night, Sophie sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city skyline, wondering when everything had gotten so complicated. Loving Ethan had been the easy part. It was surviving the fallout that threatened to destroy her. Her phone buzzed again, a blocked number. Against her better judgment, she answered. A voice she didn't recognize spoke coldly into her ear. "You were warned," it said. "Walk away while you still can. Or next time, it won't just be your job on the line." The line went dead. Sophie sat frozen, the dial tone buzzing in her ears. Threats, real ones. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. They wanted her gone, and they didn't care. How far they had to go to make it happen. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. For the first time in her life, Sophie realized that fighting for happiness wasn't just about overcoming fear. It was about facing enemies you couldn't even see, and deciding whether what you were fighting for was worth the war it would unleash. The night was a battleground inside Sophie's mind. She tossed and turned, haunted by the voice on the phone, by the photos, by the weight of a decision she didn't want to make. She had thought surviving betrayal was the hardest thing she'd ever face. She was wrong. Surviving doubt, doubting herself, doubting Ethan, was far worse. By morning, she had made a decision. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. At 9 sharp, Sophie walked into Ravenwood with her resignation letter tucked inside her bag. Her chest felt hollow, every step heavier than the last. She had worked too hard to let rumors define her, and she couldn't ask Ethan to keep sacrificing pieces of himself just to protect her. She would end it, cleanly, quietly, before the cost became too high. Diana Grant wasn't surprised to see her. In fact, it almost felt like Diana had been waiting. She accepted Sophie's letter with a tight nod, her eyes betraying nothing. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Diana said, tone clipped. Sophie just smiled thinly. "Me too." Walking back to her desk for the last time felt surreal. Colleagues she barely knew gave her sideways glances, some curious, some sympathetic. No one asked why she was leaving. Maybe they already knew. Maybe gossip traveled faster than truth ever could. Sophie packed her few belongings into a small box. A coffee mug, a few framed sketches, a battered notebook filled with half-formed dreams. It was terrifying how little she was taking with her, how easy it was to erase her existence from these halls. Ethan found her as she was leaving. He appeared at the end of the hallway, breathless, as if he had run the entire length of the building. His eyes found the box in her hands, then lifted to her face. "No," he said, voice breaking. "Sophie, please, don't do this." Sophie's throat tightened painfully. "I have to." Ethan crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. "No, you don't. We can fight this. Together." She shook her head, blinking back tears. "It's bigger than us, Ethan. They're not just coming for my career. They're coming for you too." "I don't care," he said fiercely. "I care," she cried. "I care. Too much to let you throw everything away for me." The words hung between them, raw and brutal. Sophie saw the devastation in his eyes, the silent plea, the heartbreak. She reached up, cupping his face in her trembling hands. "You have a future here, a legacy. I won't be the reason you lose it." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted him to see, to know. "Maybe one day," she whispered, "when the world isn't watching, when it's just us. Maybe then." Ethan caught her wrists, holding her in place, desperate. "Don't go," he begged. "Please." Sophie let out a broken laugh. "You once told me I needed to stop running." She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Maybe this time it's your turn to chase." And then, before she could lose her nerve, she pulled away. Sophie walked through the revolving doors of Ravenwood one last time, the city swallowing her whole. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might never leave. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end. Not really. But sometimes, loving someone meant choosing to hurt them first, choosing to fight from the shadows, choosing to believe that if it was meant to be, it would find a way back, even if it broke you first. Days blurred into a hollow echo of themselves. Sophie tried to move on. She threw herself into freelance work, took long walks through the crowded streets where no one knew her name, filled her apartment with the noise of televisions and radios she wasn't really listening to. But nothing silenced the ache that lived beneath her ribs. Ethan didn't call. He didn't text. He honored her decision just as she had asked. And somehow that hurt worse than any rejection could have. Loving someone from a distance was agony. But knowing they loved you enough to let you go, that was a wound that didn't stop bleeding. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Sophie was sketching mindlessly at a cafe when her phone buzzed. It was Mia, her old college roommate. "Turn on the news, now." Heart thudding, Sophie fumbled for the remote behind the counter. The cafe's small TV flickered to life, and there it was. Ethan Wright, standing behind a podium in front of a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, voices shouting. "I'm stepping down," Ethan said, his voice steady but raw. "Effective immediately. I'm selling my shares of Ravenwood Designs and withdrawing from all active leadership roles at Wright Global. This decision is my own. No one forced my hand. No scandal forced me out." The room exploded with noise. Sophie could barely hear over the pounding of her own heart. Ethan raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "There comes a time," he said, voice softer now, "when you realize that building empires means nothing if you destroy yourself or the people you love in the process." Sophie's vision blurred with tears. "I'm choosing a different legacy," Ethan continued, "one not built on fear or control, one built on trust, on love." He paused, scanning the crowd. Though Sophie knew he wasn't looking for the reporters, he was looking for her, always for her. Without thinking, she bolted from the cafe, leaving sketches, coffee, her whole world behind. She didn't care where he was. She only knew she had to find him. The city blurred around her as she ran, heart hammering, breathless, reckless, desperate. She didn't even feel the cold wind biting her cheeks. Didn't care about the curious stares. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. When someone ran toward you, not away, you didn't hide. You ran toward them too. She found him hours later, standing in the rain outside the first place they had met, the Carlton Grand Hotel. It was poetic in a way that made her laugh and sob at the same time. He stood there, drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, suit jacket abandoned somewhere along the way. When Ethan saw her, his face crumpled, hope and fear and devastation warring across his features. Sophie didn't stop to think. She ran straight into him, flinging her arms around his neck, pressing her soaked body against his. He caught her instantly, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing, holding her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. "I thought I lost you," Ethan whispered against her hair. "You didn't," Sophie gasped, clinging tighter. "You never did." He set her down slowly, cupping her face in his hands, searching her eyes as if needing to be sure. "I meant what I said," he whispered. "I'm done building walls. I just want a life with you." Sophie laughed through her tears. "You idiot," she said, voice breaking. "You didn't have to burn down everything. I loved you anyway." Ethan kissed her then, fierce, desperate, beautiful. The kiss of a man who had lost everything he thought mattered and realized the only thing he needed was standing right in front of him all along. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his. "So what now?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, broken and whole all at once. "Now," he said, "we build something new, together." And for the first time in a very long time, Sophie believed it. The days that followed blurred into a kind of fragile magic. Sophie and Ethan moved carefully around each other, like survivors picking through the wreckage of a storm. Nothing was easy, nothing was perfect. But for once, neither of them pretended it was supposed to be. Ethan found a small, quiet office in a forgotten corner of the city, a start-up consulting firm he barely bothered to name. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about building something honest from the ground up, without secrets, without shadows. Sophie helped him design the space, sketching blueprints between coffee breaks and laughter. They spent afternoons arguing over wall colors and office chairs, and nights falling asleep, tangled in each other's arms, whispering fears they had once buried too deep to name. Love wasn't a cure. It didn't erase the past, but it made the weight bearable. It gave them a reason to keep choosing each other day after day. One crisp November afternoon, Ethan dragged Sophie out to the city's oldest bookstore, claiming he needed her opinion on something important. She rolled her eyes, but followed him through the maze of narrow aisles and creaking floors, heart lighter than it had been in years. Near the back, tucked between dusty philosophy books and forgotten classics, Ethan stopped. He turned to her, suddenly serious. Sophie frowned. "Ethan," she asked cautiously. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tiny, battered paperback. On the cover, "Great Expectations." Sophie laughed, recognizing the reference to their first conversation months ago, the one where she had mocked him for quoting Dickens at a charity gala. "You're ridiculous," she said, smiling. Ethan grinned, but there was a tremor in it. He flipped open the book, and nestled inside was a simple silver ring. No diamonds, no fireworks, just pure, quiet promise. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. "I'm not asking for perfect," Ethan said, voice rough. "I'm not even asking for easy. I'm asking for messy mornings and late-night arguments and figuring it out, one broken piece at a time. With you." Sophie's throat closed up, tears burning behind her eyes. She reached for the ring with trembling fingers. but Ethan caught her hand gently. "Only if you're ready," he said, searching her face. Sophie laughed through a sob. "I've been ready since the moment you survived me running you over." Ethan barked out a startled laugh, the tension snapping like a brittle branch. "Technically, you only clipped me," he said, mock serious. "Details," Sophie said, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, almost like it had been waiting for her all along. He kissed her then, in the middle of the bookstore, among the smell of old paper and dreams that refused to die. It wasn't a fairy tale kiss. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was better. It was real. Later, they sat on the curb outside, sharing a pretzel and watching the city move around them, too big and too fast and too beautiful to ever fully belong to. Sophie leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the steady thud of his heart beneath her ear. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "So am I," Ethan whispered back. "But maybe that's the point." They stayed there until the stars pushed through the smog and the cold made their fingers numb, talking about nothing, planning everything, dreaming together. Not because they needed saving, but because somehow, against every odd, they had found something worth saving in each other. Winter came hard and fast, blanketing the city in a stubborn chill that refused to lift. Life didn't slow down. Bills still arrived, the world still spun, and deadlines still loomed. But for once, Sophie didn't feel like she was drowning. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't running. Their new office opened quietly in late December. No red carpets, no press releases. Just a small gathering of friends, mismatched furniture, and a battered coffee maker that groaned every time someone dared to use it. Sophie designed the space with purpose. Clean lines, warm light, shelves crammed with books and plants that refused to die. It wasn't perfect, neither were they. Ethan struggled to let go of control sometimes. Sophie caught herself doubting, retreating into old fears when things got too good. They fought over stupid things, parking tickets, burnt toast, whether a dog or a cat made a better office mascot. But the difference was they fought to stay, not to leave. One evening, after a long day of chaos and coffee stains, Ethan found Sophie curled up on the office couch, flipping through a stack of client proposals. He stood there for a moment, just watching her, the woman who had changed everything by simply refusing to let him hide. "You know," he said, breaking the quiet, "this place doesn't feel like an empire." Sophie looked up, arching an eyebrow. "Disappointed?" He smiled slowly, shaking his head. "No, it feels like home." She laughed, tossing a pillow at him. "Sappy much, right?" "Terrible influence," he agreed, sitting down beside her. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching. The city lights flicker through the frosted windows. Later that night, Ethan pulled Sophie onto the rooftop terrace. It was freezing, and she shivered against him, but he just wrapped his arms tighter around her. Snowflakes drifted down lazily, catching in her hair, painting the world in soft, imperfect beauty. "You ever think about how we got here?" Sophie asked, voice muffled against his chest. "Every day," Ethan said. He tilted her chin up, studying her with a look that still made her knees weak. "You crashed into me, remember? You walked in front of my car," she countered, laughing. He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers. "Best accident of my life." Sophie kissed him back, slow and lingering, and for the first time she didn't feel fear humming beneath her skin. Just certainty, just love. Messy, terrifying, extraordinary love. They didn't make grand promises that night. No sweeping vows or declarations carved in stone. Just two people standing against the cold, choosing each other. Choosing to believe that even broken things, even battered hearts, could be beautiful, if you were brave enough to love them anyway. The city roared on below them, vast and unknowable. But on that rooftop, in that fragile slice of forever, Sophie Carter and Ethan Wright built something stronger than empires. They built a life, together, imperfect, unfinished, real, and that was enough. Wow, what a story, right? I'd love to hear what you thought. Drop a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tell me where you're watching from. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories we have on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you.